Hello, all, and welcome to another Rising Tide Talk. This is the first one of 2024, so Happy New Year, and hope everybody had a wonderful Christmas time, New Year's, and any other, winter celebrations that you may have participated in or celebrated in this fantastic holiday season. I'm Matt, Roleplay Chat Capelli, and today we will be talking about tabletop RPG layout for beginners. We are joined today by an expert in the TTRPG graphic design space, or in the graphic design space, I think, just in general. But he's an editor, a game designer, and all of his work is kind of focused on strong information design and heightening the player user experience. So please join me in welcoming Gordon McAlpin to our interview today, so everybody can go crazy and chat and do all of that fun stuff. I'm glad you're here, Gordon. I'm really looking forward to talking about layout and design in role-playing games. It's something that is kind of a blind spot for me. So you'll have to bear with me if my questions don't make a whole lot of sense. I tried my best. It's for beginners. This is a conversation for beginners.
Right,
so
right.
I was really putting myself into the skin of somebody who didn't know anything about layout.
I did no research whatsoever, so I could identify with the complete beginners. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, nice. No, that totally works.
I did do some research, but anyway, the plan today is for us to cover three main topics. The first is to talk about like the definitions, the basics of the importance of having a good layout and strong design. The second pillar is going to be just advice and layout considerations for a variety of different mediums in the TTRPG space and context.
Great.
And then the last, third, final section is going to be just recommendations for tools and resources and learning material and that kind of stuff. Does that sound good?
Yeah, some of this might kind of get a little muddied.
That's fine. Fine.
Yeah.
Perfect. So before we dive into everything, people listening here live in the Rising Tide Discord server, I encourage you to hype us up in chat. I always like getting a good hype up in the chat here. And then if you have questions, specific questions for Gordon, I'd like to direct you towards the RT Discussions text chat, which I think somebody will probably paste in the chat for today's discussion here on stage. So you can put your questions there, and then at the last 15 minutes or so, or 20, 15 minutes of today's conversation, I'm going to go and pull those questions out and kind of grill Gordon live with questions that he's never had the opportunity to look at yet. So yeah, let's go. Let's start it off with a pretty foundational question, I think.
Ready.
So when we talk about layout in the context of TTRPGs,
Okay.
and I know this is kind of loaded, Gordon, so I'm sorry, but
Okay.
What exactly are we referring to when we say that, layout and design in TTRPGs?
Well, so as we discussed in the kind of pre-interview, I don't know if you'd call me old school or if I'm just sort of particular about this, but I feel very strongly that graphic design typically is actually two separate related fields, which is design and production. Design is figuring out all the rules and how things are supposed to look, the general kind of look and feel, relationships between everything. And the layout is actually applying those rules to a manuscript, to images, using all of those rules and blah, blah, blah. So graphic design and production, or print production if you're talking about a print book, or web production if you're talking about a digital one, are separate but related. And because role-playing games are a small industry, typically those are both done by the same person. And because role-playing games have what people call game designers, and they typically just call them designers, it probably makes more sense to just call the graphic designer the layout artist. But in my experience outside of role-playing games, that is kind of a loaded sort of, it has repercussions, I guess. Let me put it this way: outside of role-playing games, and I don't know how much Wizards of the Coast pays, or how many people you would even consider a major publisher in role-playing games, but at the publishing companies that I've worked for, the clients that I've worked for, design and production are always separate. Design tends to get paid better. And so my reluctance to accept the layout artist label is largely because I think it drives wages down. You don't design a house and build it and call yourself a construction worker. You're like, no, I'm an architect and I designed and built my house.
Yeah.
It's so it's sort of unfortunate that you kind of have to pick one of the roles to label yourself. Personally, I just pick the bigger, more creative, more important, I think, role in this in the sense that, you know, design is making all of the decisions and layout is applying those. And so I prefer being called a graphic designer. That's the short version. I prefer being called a graphic designer. But page layout, when it comes to role-playing games, is how the information, how the rules, mechanics, the tables are being presented. And there are ways to do that can, you know, help communicate the concepts at play. And there are ways that can actively kind of work against that. You know, if you are trying to show a skill tree and show the relationships between those skills through the structure of the tree, you know, it helps to have design elements that underscore that kind of hint at it or explicitly just, you know, draw lines between boxes. But you could do that a lot of different ways. And so how you do that is a design decision versus you know, applying that to the 1,200 tables that you might have in a book.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's making the text and the pictures integrated in a way that explains the game.
Totally. And I think, to go back to what you were saying before about how the nomenclature can kind of muddy the water in a number of different ways, I think what adds even more confusion to all of this is the fact that a lot of TTRPG projects are pretty small scale. Like, I mean, in the indie scene anyway, and a lot of people in this community here were working on smaller projects, working on projects where the game designer and the graphic designer might be
the same person. Yeah.
All of the design hats might be the same person.
Yeah.
And folks can correct me if I'm wrong or ask more pointed questions to Gordon in the RT discussion text chat. But I think that definitely adds a little bit of complexity here. One thing that you touched on a little bit, Gordon, was how it can help to bring the game to life, add flavor to the game, but also make it easier to understand. Could you elaborate a little bit more about why you consider the design of a game, as far as like its visual design and its layout, like why that's important? Keeping in mind that there's a lot of different creators in this community here. We have people that are writers, but also people who are, you know, cartographers or character artists and podcasters and voice actors and stuff like that.
I would say that on some level, it is not a requirement. Like, strictly speaking, you could play Dungeons and Dragons, never actually read the rule book, just read a text dump of it. Let's just pretend we've acquired this legally, because piracy is bad. But yeah, so you could play D&D without ever looking at the rule books, without ever looking at any art for it or anything like that. But you know, I think the assumptions that you're going to make as a player are going to be a lot different than if you came to it with, you know, the lush painted illustrations that many of the 5e books has, or if you came to it with original D&D's crude, shall we say, black and white line art drawings. You know, like and some of that's technological, of course, but the fonts that you use, the texture, the visual textures that you use, and I mean like page backgrounds and little splashes that you use to kind of like ground floating illustrations and things like that, and the art that you choose, it realizes the game world for your players in a very concrete way. Like, I think most people have some knowledge of what, you know, fantasy looks like. I'm doing finger quotes. I realize nobody can see me. But yeah, finger quotes around what fantasy looks like, because, you know, 5e looks like a particular way. Pathfinder books, I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but Paizo is really fond of very cluttered sort of character designs. Hey, if you like it, it's awesome. You know, Lord of the Rings movies have a very particular look about them. Things like that. So you can kind of communicate the game world, certainly like it just purely as a fictional world, through the art and even the typography and the textures that you use. It's probably a little harder if that's a little more disconnected. This is a little bit of an abstract conversation to be having, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like, you know, the choices that you make kind of play into how something looks. You know, if you designed a book and you just a fantasy book and you did it all in Helvetica and in black and white and no art, it's going to feel a lot different than using the typography that's in the existing, you know, WotC books. They use a particular choice of fonts that kind of lean into I wouldn't say a Middle Ages or medieval, you know, aesthetic, but it's slightly older and a little more antiquated deliberately
Hmm.
because it wants to evoke like an earlier time, sort of. I know it's a fantasy world and not connected and not on Earth, but
Yeah, yeah,
you
no,
get the gist.
exactly. Yeah, it does kind of help set the stage, if you will. It gives
Mhm.
the stage dressing for the ambiance, let's say, that they're trying to set. Okay, so one last really quick question for you, Gordon, and then we'll maybe move on to some of the more concrete stuff. I'm wondering, and I was wondering when I was developing my questions for you, considering layout and design, I know it's probably always pretty important, but are there certain
Yeah.
projects where you feel like we really should consider it? And if we don't, we're doing ourselves a pretty big disservice as content creators in this space.
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, it's funny because like for role playing games outside of the book, you don't need anything. Dice, you know.
Hmm.
When it comes to like a board game, though, like the design, the look and feel of that board is half the flavor. You know, like it's as important as a map is to D&D. Like, yeah, you don't need the map, but it sure gives your players a concrete sense of the space that they're in,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's really what a board game does too. So the stuff around that you could get away with being a little bit more functional, but like the board game, it's you spend so much time looking at it. It's probably in games, it's probably I would say the single most important thing to make sure is designed, very intentionally and very aesthetically. If you're talking about a one-page RPG, I do think that a lot of the character and a lot of the charm of those comes from the fact that this designer takes a very hand-drawn, very handmade approach. You could communicate a lot with that,
Hmm.
and like, yeah, you could cram a lot more facts and figures and tables and stuff in if you did everything digitally, but there's also something that you can convey solely through hand-drawn art, you know.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so now let's try to get to some a little bit more crunchy stuff. So
Okay.
now, Gordon, I'm going to be asking you for some advice for myself and for the audience here in the RT Talks community. So I guess the first one is, in broad strokes,
Mhm.
what would you consider to be some of the tenets of good layout? When someone's making their book or their game or their system or whatever it is,
Sure.
what are
Sure.
some of these core principles that they should be trying to adhere to?
First thing that pops into my head is the information hierarchy. The information hierarchy is well, it's kind of the order and sequence and hierarchy, I guess, of the importance of the data that you're presenting. And you have to look at every chapter is essentially a chunk of data. There are rules, and so for instance, when you're dealing with more like obviously modular chunks of information, like all of the classes in Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, the fighter, the cleric, etc. Those all have common elements. They have they might have a prerequisite. They have certain features that they give you at certain levels, and so on. And when you've designed a system that has classes or spells or feats, and you have all of that information kind of gathered together, you want to present like information in the same way consistently, because the second you say, well, okay, we're just going to make the thief chapter look completely different than the fighter, cleric, etc. chapters, you're creating a disconnect with the aesthetics of that page, despite the fact that the information is meant to be related and look related. And so the more you can do to keep information displayed and communicated consistently, the better people will understand that those are related. And it obviously, with classes, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's sort of obvious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But when you start getting down into bizarre, like a feature that might be granted by a skill, are you communicating all of the features across skills and feats and character classes in a consistent way, and not just arbitrarily deciding to do something slightly different because it looks good to the detriment potentially of the people trying to understand the system. So, and maybe that some of that speaks to the fact that I tend to approach books very rigidly. I'll never come up with a book that looks like Morkborg, because although that book looks phenomenal, I can't understand it. It's a chaotic, and I think that's the point. And it's beautiful. Like I love that designer's work, but it is difficult for me to understand. And so like kind of keeping things clean in order to support the reader's understanding of the information that they're engaged with.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think, some of these games are complicated enough as it is. Anything that we can do to make it easier for people to pick up and understand is always to everybody's mutual benefit, right? So that's really solid advice. Mm-hmm. Now, the way I kind of organize this next question, Gordon, is a little bit like a rapid fire type of question. So I'm hoping to go through a list of different forms of content, written content or otherwise, in the TTRPG space. And if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to hear some kind of advice or consideration that kind of pops into your mind related to that particular thing, and of course, in the world of layout and design. Does that kind of make sense?
Sure. So you're gonna put me on the spot, and I'm gonna say a lot, but but yeah, let's see how this goes.
Yeah, let's see how it goes, and if you feel like the advice is repeating itself or whatnot, we can figure something out. I could cut this segment short, but
okay, we'll see.
Yeah, so let's go with one of the things that I think people tend to consider the most often when we talk about writing or creating content, and it's long form TTRPG systems. Let's say somebody in the audience here is writing their own set of rules. They're creating their own game, a new game, and it's a long form, so many dozens of pages long. Yeah. What kind of advice or consideration kind of pops into your head first when you think of designing something like that?
The first thing that pops into my head is hire a good editor. Because no matter how good of an editor you think you are, you can't edit your own stuff. It's called proofreading your own stuff, and it's just part of the writing process. But you cannot. It is impossible to edit your own work. And I always hire an editor. Everybody should hire an editor. I've even edited for other people. I still hire an editor for myself. and part of that, again, it kind of goes back to ensuring things that everything's consistent. So that's the first thing that pops into my head.
All right. I mean, we can move on to the next one, or if there's another thing that comes into mind, you can always bring it up later.
Sure.
So let's do the converse of that. Let's do a really short TTRPG system, or like you mentioned earlier, a one page or a micro game. When we're thinking of layout and design, what's something that comes into mind for you as far as advice goes?
This kind of goes back again. I think for a one-page TTRPG, aesthetics, because it's hard to explain, but I don't think that a one-page RPG has enough longevity unless you give people something to kind of attach to, and I think visually the look and feel of that page communicates tone and attitude much more effectively than just a chunk of text. And because you have no other avenues for communicating tone besides maybe one illustration or two, or a couple of really tiny scribbles, doodly sorts of things. But again, that's aesthetics. So
that's good advice. Totally. All right, let's go in a different direction now. What about people creating modules or adventures for existing systems? Things like a new D&D adventure or a Call of Cthulhu mystery or something of that nature. What should they consider?
Cool. Design patterns. Specifically, if you're doing an adventure for 5e, it needs to look like a 5e adventure. You can't arbitrarily decide that you could do things better than WotC, because the way people understand the adventures is already kind of explained to people in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Arguably, the 5e DMG doesn't do that very well. But people have probably run a published adventure, maybe just a starter kit thing, before they've picked up any DM's Guild things. And so just about everybody who comes to an adventure book is coming to it with this prior knowledge. And if you deviate from that, it impacts how people can understand it. You want the most important information up front, always. And some of this starts getting into editing again, because it's sort of like how you organize the information and how you feed it to people sequentially. You need to give the people the big picture first, and then start going into the granularity. The first adventure should always have, this is basically an overview of what happens in the adventure, and then here's kind of a more granular breakdown. Within each chapter, you should do the same kind of thing. If your editor doesn't already do that, you should strongly recommend it. But yeah, so like that doesn't really address graphic design as much, but it is design related in the sense that it's about your information hierarchy. So as the designer, it is something that you should be mindful of, partly because if somebody's information hierarchy isn't right, then they're going to have a bunch of text that's under the wrong headers. And so that'll also impact people's understanding of things. So.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's go to something a little different again here. What about more visual mediums? Like, I know there's a lot of like cartographers and map makers in this community. Sure. When we think about layout in that context, is there anything that comes to mind to you?
No sideways maps. Bad. Sideways maps are bad. I don't know. That's the first thing that popped into my head. I know every once in a while people have included like a sideways map in a book. I think that's I don't think you want people to turn your role-playing game rule book sideways. Just you also want people to be able to refer to the map and the text that may be on the opposite side of the spread at the same time, which not everybody is able to read sideways or upside down. I personally am pretty good at it, but it's just not a good idea. So other than try to make sure your maps are always, either vertical on the spread or half page horizontal or something like that, but not full page and horizontal.
Totally.
You can also, the design of a map also speaks a lot to communication of tone and stuff. When you do work as a graphic designer, when you do work with a cartographer, it's always good to talk about type first. Do you want to do the type so that it's consistent with the other tables? Because a map is a table. People sometimes don't think of them that way. They are just very, very pretty tables, sort of. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And actually that brings me to another one on this list was tables, whether that be integrating tables into some kind of material, or I know a lot of writers in this space just create like these compendiums of things where it's just like 100 random tables or a long list of NPC names, stuff of this nature. Maybe those are two different things. I and forgive me if they are, but what do you think of with that kind of stuff?
I don't know. Honestly, the first thing that pops into my head is that a pet peeve of mine is when people design tables to look wildly different than the rest of the body text. Like I think the table size should generally be roughly the same, like the size of your text in a table, that is, should be roughly the same size as the text in the book itself. I would say exactly the same size, and I would take a ruler and smack the hands of any graphic designer that just, needs to fit in a couple of extra words. So they're gonna make the text smaller just in this one place. Like, yeah. Design is about rules and patterns. And if you make one exception to a pattern here, in one place, it may not seem like a big deal, but if you start doing that anytime you have something that doesn't quite fit perfectly, too many exceptions. Do you even have rules anymore? So yeah, you want to do things as consistently as possible, especially when it's something like a table, because tables are so modular in terms of like the data in them, and they need to be able to kind of relate to each other. You need to be able to look at a fighter table and a cleric table and understand them as being essentially two versions of the same table with different data in it, Yeah. So yeah, it's Haggard Clint. Hey Clint, just chimed in and said, design is where form and function break even. That's a great way to put it. I tend to emphasize function over form. Books are essentially interactive objects themselves. People don't think about that in the sense that it's not interactive in the same way that a computer game is. But you still need to look through it and flip through it and find things using the book. And so if the book doesn't give you those wayfinding tools that you need, an index, a table of contents, chapter headers, running footers, etc., then you're failing at making an interactive object.
Totally. All right, cool, cool, good, good, good. I'm looking at the time, and I just like peeked at the RT discussions chat, and there's a lot of questions there. So I'm gonna
Oh, oh
maybe
no.
skip ahead
Okay.
and start talking. Let's talk a little bit about resources and tools,
Okay.
and then let's try to give ourselves, 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
I mean, it's gonna be tough. We'll make it happen.
Yeah.
I'll find a way to make it happen. So real quick, Gordon, as far as resources and tools go,
Mhm.
we had a little bit of a chat
Yeah.
earlier on about the kind of digital tools that you're familiar with. Can you give us a really quick pitch of the tools that you really like using, and then we can kind of move on to something else?
So I mean, I know the first thing anybody wants to hear when you talk about page layout is which page layout program I should use. And I kind of have a two-pronged answer. And the first is if you want to do client work, if you want to be a professional graphic designer, take work from clients, work for anybody, you have to use the industry standard programs. You have to use InDesign, you have to use Illustrator and Photoshop. You're going to use all three, may as well get all three. if you know all three of those programs, you're in good shape. Can you get by if you're a hobbyist and you just want to use Affinity because it's cheaper? Yes, absolutely can. Are certain things going to be a lot harder if you use Affinity versus InDesign? Probably. I can't tell you what they are because I've never used Affinity. But my understanding of it is that it doesn't support some of the advanced features that InDesign does, like grep, which is, I don't even know what it stands for. It's essentially like a sort of coding markup sort of protocol language. I don't know
Mm.
that you can use to, for instance, set up a rule in your paragraph styles so that the last 10 letters of a paragraph all get the no break style attached to it, which prevents you from having really short line lengths at the end of of a paragraph, otherwise known as, I think, runts or possibly widows. I don't know exactly, but the really short line at the end of a paragraph is ugly, and generally speaking, people recommend fixing that. And
Mhm.
grep can do that automatically, or you could go through the book manually and insert, non-breaking spaces and things like that, which can also work, but it also litters the manuscript with extra stuff and can cause problems if the manuscript gets edited down the road and things like that. So anyway, the point being, Affinity does most of what you need, but what it doesn't do is let you open Wizards of the Coast's InDesign files because it's not InDesign. The majority of the work that I do is on 5e stuff. I do a lot of stuff for Beetle and Grimm's. I've worked with MCDM a lot, and so all the 5e stuff is all pretty similar.
Mm.
But yeah, but like for instance, Wizards uses InDesign. Actually, I'd go into Wizards of the Coast files for the licensed projects that I do for Beetle and Grimm's, and so if I had Affinity, I literally just could not take that work. That'd be like a third of my income gone. So when beginners ask, what program they should use, it's kind of like, what do you want to do? If you want to do design professionally, I really, really strongly recommend InDesign, because why learn Affinity and then have to learn InDesign down the road? Maybe there's some similarities. I don't know.
Mhm.
But yeah, just learn one program.
And speaking of those people who are new to learning the software, whether that be InDesign or something else, let's focus on InDesign because that seems to be
Sure.
the industry standard. Is there a place where you recommend people go to learn? Like maybe it's like a teaching tool that can help them kind of learn the ropes, whether that be free or paid. Where could someone get started in learning InDesign?
Yeah, I unfortunately, my information on this is a little out of date. When I was a grad student, I did teach a class on InDesign, Illustrator, and Photoshop, and we used Lynda a lot. I think Lynda got bought by LinkedIn, but I still think there's LinkedIn Learning or something like that. And there's
Okay.
definitely YouTube videos. I'm sure some of them are great. Hopefully, somebody can recommend one. But I haven't been a beginning user of any software layout program since like I was in college. Like since I switched from Quark Express to InDesign CS2, I think, which I don't even remember when that was, but it was a long time ago.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Cool. Good, good, good. And then as far as like formal education in this kind of stuff goes,
sure.
like should people who are interested in this go to school? I imagine people go to school for this kind of stuff. It's complicated enough.
Well, I did go to school and I did get my MFA. I gotta say though, when you go to graphic design school, they don't really teach you anything.
I think that applies to a lot of fields. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, what they do is they give you projects, and it is up to you to learn how to do what you want to do in a way that satisfies that project.
Hmm.
And so, you might tell the story of your life through a role-playing game book, but the assignment was tell the story of your life through some designed object. And you're like, I'm going to do a role-playing game book. When I was in grad school, I did a lot of animation and some video work. you know.
What about like reading material? Are there books or
Oh, for sure.
things of that nature that you often look to or have in the past?
Yes, and this steps away from the software discussion a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things that I see beginning designers not do well enough is handle typography. They think InDesign handles all of it for them, I think, is generally the assumption. And that's not the case. There are going to be times where your design has rules set up that you're going to need to override manually because, for instance, certain styles have a little space after built into them. But that space after is assuming that the next paragraph is going to be a core body style. If it's a header style, that header already has a space before it. And so if you have the space after from a bulleted item and the space before a header item next to each other, you actually have the wrong amount of space between those two items. So you have to manually remove the space on, well, one of them, usually the bullet.
Yeah.
So there's always things like that. And like if, InDesign were better and had contingent styles, it could know to do this. I think QuirkXPress or some other page layout programs have actually been able to do this in the past. So, again, this isn't software specific, but I think Designing with Type by Ellen Lupton is a fantastic typography book. That is, it may talk a little bit about InDesign, but is largely just typographic rules. Literally go onto Amazon or your preferred bookseller and just look for typography books. There are very few of them. Most of them are excellent because the only people who give a shit about this stuff are people that care a lot about this stuff. The people who write these books care. So yeah, like typography is a big one. I would really recommend Designing with Type as a first book on type.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it'll talk a little bit about like the choice of typefaces, but it's also really just about the relationships between them and why you do certain things and why you don't do certain things, and some of the other kind of more like incredibly nitpicky rules, like what an M dash is versus an N dash, and a plus, and what a minus sign is versus a hyphen, and that is kind of one of the things that people get wrong a lot in their first TTRPG books.
Okay, yeah.
is not getting their correct typographical symbols because typewriters are terrible and don't actually have most of them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's great advice. Some good recommendations for sure. Thanks, Gordon.
Sure.
Now we're going to shift over to the questions from the audience. So I'm going to remind folks that you can ask questions in the RT discussions text chat. There's quite a few of them there already, so I don't know if reminding you to put more was a wise idea or not. But so I might skip over a few if I think we've covered them. But if I skipped your question and you don't feel like it was answered, please make a fuss and we'll make sure that the question gets asked to Gordon. So the first question here is from Long John Jones. Long John Jones asks, how do page graphics come into existence? Notes and table borders, footer graphics, etc. Who is responsible for creating those? Is this separate from the larger content-specific images like a portrait of a character, etc.?
So in a perfect world, in the what I would call the correct world, all the page elements are designed by the graphic designer, not the layout artist. The layout artist should never need to create anything. Maybe make a couple of like a unique mask or something for a special case. But all of the look and feel should be set completely by the designer. They should anticipate all of the patterns that the layout artist should possibly need. And so the designer is the person who creates that. They can, you might work with an illustrator to create some of that. I know when I've done the books with NCDM, for instance, you look in the credits for that. I'm one of many graphic designers on the book. I am the sole layout artist, and so I did all of the page layout, but the design of the borders might have been handled by one illustrator. The design of the drop caps might have been handled by Jason Hassenauer, who's the art director, and so on. And so graphic designers create all of those page elements. I personally like to do as much of that stuff as possible because it's somewhat illustrative without the pressure of drawing a picture or painting. I can't paint at all, so But yeah, so the graphic designer should be doing that.
Okay, cool.
And and this is just gonna finger waggle about my Pinko labor stuff. If somebody is expecting you to design things on a $5 a page layout rate, push back, because that's not how this works.
It's a good caveat. Nala Wu asks, what do you consider standard rates to be for layout work? And there's some added context here, but in an effort of making sure I get through everyone's questions, we're just going to stick to that. In a little bit of context, Nayla is a graphic designer who's starting to seek paid layout work, and just kind of, I guess, to help set the barometer for that, what would you consider to be the standard rates for layout work?
There aren't any. Charge what you could get away with. I remember when I first started doing books, I had a lot of people asking me to do $5 a page. But again, like I mentioned, that's $5 for layout and design. And I think that's BS. That's way too low. You can work for next to free if you are invested creatively in a project. There is nothing wrong with working for a royalty only rate. You want to get a really good portfolio piece, you find somebody who will let you work royalty only. You could do whatever the hell you want. That is your portfolio piece because they're not paying you except in the royalties on the back end. So you get more creative freedom when they aren't paying you that design rate on top of it. I personally, I started in this space charging like 35 an hour, 35, 45 an hour when I wasn't doing more flat rate gigs. Now I flat out don't take flat rate gigs anymore because they always screw me. And I charge 60 or 65 an hour depending on when I started with that client. So, it probably works out to, if I was doing a book, it probably works out to like $20 a page. I don't know. I at some point I did the math on some of the NCDM stuff because they're like 400 pages and I got a healthy chunk of change on it because it took a lot of time. But yeah, like I would never. I personally prefer hourly rates. And I just don't like page rates because all page rates do is incentivize the layout artist to do the simplest, fastest thing that they can. And I don't want to do those kinds of books. And so I don't want to be hired for those kinds of projects. Totally. And so I'm like, yeah, hourly.
All right.
If, and I can have a conversation with the client to be like, how much time do we really want to spend on this? How much, if we want something really ornate, it's just going to take a lot more hours. But also the hourly rate just gets you around any need to be like, hey, this isn't, in line with what we were discussing in my flat rate or my $5 a page or $10 a page, whatever layout rate. You don't need to constantly have these conversations of what is or isn't in scope or out of scope or whatever. You can just say, well, that's just going to be more hours. So yeah.
Yeah. And then that kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility to say that and push back in a nicer way almost. If you want to pay me those 20 more hours, then have at it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Exactly.
Nala asks, how would pricing change for more custom illustrative layout work? So I think in that case, we're talking about maybe doing like a digital collage or playing with hand-drawn assets. Outside of saying that it probably should be a higher rate, is there any other...
I don't think it should be a higher rate.
Oh, no? Okay.
No, I charge the same rate for everything. You could send me to go get you coffee and it's still going to be $65 an hour. That's what I cost. So yeah, no, I want to just avoid any conversations where somebody's like, well, that's really more design, so that should be a higher rate, or sorry, that's really more layout, so that should be at a lower rate. I'm like, no. it's the same rate. And if I'm fast enough, nobody should have nobody should be complaining about what my rate is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm fast enough, it's still only going to cost them, $300 or $800 for a simple, color or something, whatever,
Yeah, exactly.
The time takes however long it takes. I don't want to discourage myself from taking the time to do a little bit of research in order to turn out better work. I take the time to do it right. And that's kind of my attitude about it. It's a little uncompromising, and maybe that's because I can get away with it. But I've lost arguments. I just want to say I have lost plenty of arguments with clients. But when it comes to pay, I don't lose that one because I just don't take those jobs anymore. So
yeah, and I think that's a good lesson for people to have. Like, it's a good lesson for people to learn through you, right? But anyway, okay, let's keep going. I'm worried about time, and Nayla, you've asked a couple questions that I haven't gone to yet, but I want to make sure I get to everybody. Let everybody speak, and then I'll maybe circle back to other folks who've asked questions already. But let's go to Pika Voka. Pika Voka asks that industry standards for physical publishing are Adobe InDesign, Photoshop, and something else, ? Is Clip Studio Paint an all right alternative to Photoshop?
To Photoshop, honestly, if you can export a PSD file, yeah, you could probably get away with using Clip Studio Paint or anything really. As long as it exports a PSD file, you've got a lot more flexibility in terms of photo editing programs or photo painting programs. Clip Studio, I'm more familiar with it as for comics, but I know that you can do a lot with it. So yeah, I think it really kind of depends on what you're trying to do. But as long as you can export a PSD, anything goes.
Perfect.
For images.
Perfect. Cool. Now let's go to a question from Long John Jones. Long John Jones asks, what are your footholds in the greater industry community? Things like Discord servers, publications, forums, and websites.
Well, let's see. I visit TTRPG, A Rising Tide, of course. I'm semi-active in the layout channel, and that's kind of it. I chat on Irregardless with Robin Shar, who are in the audience right now, and I'm on Twitter too, and Blue Sky, I guess. I have been kind of quiet on the social medias in recent months, but yeah, you can find me through there. I find some of the aspects of the social media wing of the TTRPG community a little frustrating. So I try to lurk more than I talk. And we're probably all better off because of it.
Yeah, your personal mental health is probably thanking you for not engaging in social media discourse.
I used to.
Yeah, I know. I do. I used to a lot too, and I'm like, you know what? I don't know if my brain can handle this today.
Yeah, right, exactly.
All right, Gordon, we have 4 more. Do you think we can rapid fire through them?
Yeah, I mean, take your time.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that people here could hear everything you have to say without having to leave the audience and things like that. But
sure.
Yeah, so real quick, Nala asks, what are your design icks? And by icks, they mean, not things that are objectively bad design, but things that are subjective for you personally that you don't like.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, it's hard for me to think of anything that, like, I wouldn't even say that poor contrast is necessarily even objectively bad design. Because, I mean, yes, it impacts readability, but there are ways you can mitigate or offset that. And there may be reasons why you kind of want something to be more obscured. So that, it's weird because, you could generally break almost all of the design rules.
Yeah.
But yeah, I am drawing a blank on that one.
That's all right. You can just say that you don't have any, right?
I 100% do. I'm just having a hard time figuring out what any of them are. Like I said, changing the font size arbitrarily is one of my biggest pet peeves. And I wouldn't say, to some extent there is an objective argument for why you shouldn't do that, but I wouldn't say that it's like some hard and fast cardinal, sin.
Yeah.
Either for if somebody does break it. But I really strongly feel like you should never ever change the size of your type for similar information.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because it's not the right size.
And I do this a lot in my day job, so I'm happy you're saying it because now I'm never gonna do it again. I don't
Yeah.
really write for public audiences, but anyway, yes, that's good advice. All right, another question from Long John Jones. Have you considered the value of non-physical TTRPG documents or resources, such as more interactive websites with interactive character sheets, document rules, etc., rather than just
Yeah.
PDF or digital versions of physical books? If so, have
Yeah.
you seen good examples of that you can recall? Are there unique mediums for TTRPGs that you have seen?
I will say yes, I've considered it, and no, I'm not familiar with too many good examples of that. It's tricky because, it really to understand a complex rule system, you kind of need the book.
Hmm.
But having a secondary reference source, like having the book online, broken down in a comprehensible way that really emphasizes the granularity of the data in a manuscript. Yes, there's absolutely ways that, for instance, Roll20 has its, what do they call it, a compendium or something. It's basically where all the rules are reposited, and they do a very poor job of linking things together. I think they might do a little bit more than they used to. It might be better. I just know that a few years ago, it seemed to be like they took the top results of all of the 5e search items, and they were useless pages because you had to log in or have access to a certain thing. That bothered me. But yeah, like there, my like I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm not sure if this is gonna that part's gonna make it into it, but I did my MFA thesis on this interactive, image and text live, archive. And you could absolutely do the same with role playing games in a way that was really, really cross referenced to emphasize how the concepts are connected and make it easy to just jump around the book to kind of follow your own thread of
Hmm.
thought as opposed to just the flow of information that the text presents to you.
Yeah, awesome. All right. And then one last question for you, Gordon. Long John Jones asks one other question here, and it's about your workflow. So, is there one task in your workflow you don't really particularly look forward to?
I wouldn't say that it's something I need to work up to, but it is definitely something that is more on the soul sucking side. But after the template is all built and I get that first text import with the entire manuscript, ideally the entire manuscript, like 300 pages, and it's just this text dump. Applying just the basic formatting to that, like ensuring that all of the header styles, and if you have a really good editor who works with you on this can be a lot less work, but there's always some degree of manual
Mm.
work. Breaking, pulling out the sidebars and the tables and building the tables. That is just pure grunt work. And oh my God, I want to die. At the same time, it's also a great opportunity to turn your brain off and just go on autopilot for like 6 hours straight or longer
Hmm.
if you need to. It's also kind of enjoyable in that sense, but yeah, it's not the fun part. The fun part for me is designing the template and the look and feel. And I just happen to be good at the page layout part, so I also do that.
Awesome. Yeah.
It's also probably more time consuming, so it's a good chunk of work too. So,
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, awesome. Thanks, Gordon.
of course,
Thank
yeah.
you so much for being here to chat about, design and layout and all of that good stuff. Before we say our goodbyes, I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of, if there's any other last thoughts or parting words or considerations that we didn't get a chance to touch on tonight with regards to TTRPG layout and design, this could be your opportunity to provide that. And then, of course, when you're done with that, if you have anything,
Mhm.
to please let us know and remind us of where we can find you personally, whether that be on socials or any of your projects.
So I think the one thing that we haven't talked about is I want to say cascading style sheets. So in your paragraph styles, and this is going to be an InDesign or Affinity, any page layout program has style sheets already defined in them. And what you can do is you could define like your core body style as being like this typeface, this type size, blah blah blah. What you want to do is create kind of like three master styles, one for your serif type, one for your headers, one for your sans serif type. and use those to essentially define as many of the rules as possible. And then you might have a couple of, alternate styles for like core bulleted or core hanging subheads, and those are all referenced to core body. And the reason you build it this way is that you can then change core body's font style, or sorry, typeface, the font that the core body uses, and it will update everywhere. And so that's what it means by cascading. And so if you have like 3 styles that govern like 90% of the rules, you can radically alter in any existing 5e template that you've got and use it on any other 5e book, and it will look completely different. It will save you hours and hours and hours just constantly having to redefine all of the styles and every time you build a new book. It cuts that down to changing some colors, changing maybe a typeface, and maybe a couple of distances and things like that. So yeah, working efficiently is the most important thing you can do as a layout artist. And these are the things that are not really truly taught in any, like, nobody teaches you that stuff in the software classes. They're not going to tell you why to do that. And those are the kinds of things that you learn through trial and error after having done 10 books and kind of versioned it off. That's the easy way to version off a template from one book into a new book. And yeah, so like you might have one that's kind of Wizards of the Coast size, and you might have one that's kind of 8.5 by 11 size, and just kind of move the style sheets around. But yeah, cascading style sheets. Beyond that, you could find me on Twitter at GMcAlpin. GordonMcAlpin.com is my portfolio site. Multiplex10.com is an animated web series that I did a few years ago.
Awesome. Cool.
I'm very proud of that. I think it's very funny. It's a little dated now because it's all about movies that aren't out anymore. But those are the ways to find me, and hopefully you've found something useful throughout this whole conversation. If not, ask me more questions on Twitter.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again, Gordon. And
yeah, no problem.
For those of you who are here right now, Demille just posted some of Gordon's stuff, links and whatnot in the chat for this. So please go check it out. I highly recommend everyone go take a look at Gordon's work. Be sure to give him a follow on the social media platform of your choice. And while you're at it, I'd like to encourage you to also follow us, the TTRPG Rising Tide, on your socials. That's at TTRPG Rising Tide. I think we're on Tumblr now, on X, on Mastodon, and on Blue Sky too, if I'm not mistaken. I'd also appreciate it if you spreaded the word of this wonderful community with any of your friends in the TTRPG content creation space, designers, writers, you name it. This is a community for TTRPG creatives by TTRPG creatives. With that said, I'm Matt at roll_play_chat on all socials, and this has been another Rising Tide Talk. Join us live in our Discord community for our next event taking place next month. We haven't quite landed on a date yet, but it's going to be with Tom Kartos. It's going to be a fun chat for sure, and I hope to see you there, so stay tuned for details about that. Thanks, Gordon, for being here for this.
Thank you.